Pariyatti Audiobooks presents A Buddhist Social Ethic for the New Century, From Facing the Future by Bhikkhu Bodhi, narrated by Shalina Hetherington. A Buddhist Social Ethic for the New Century. The arrival of a new century is always a time of great ferment and great expectations. And when the new century also marks the dawn of a new millennium, our expectations are likely to be especially intense. An inherent optimism makes us think that the new is always bound to be better than the old, that the arrival of the next year or century will inevitably bring our wildest dreams to fulfillment. Unfortunately, however, life is not so simple that the mere ticking of the clock and a change of calendars are enough to undo the knots with which we have tied ourselves up by our rash decisions and ill-considered actions through all the preceding months, years, and decades. One fact that past experience should deeply impress on us is the need to look carefully beneath the surface of events for hidden tendencies that portend future harm. The importance of this guideline is brought home for us by reflection on the transition from the 19th to the 20th century. In the Western world, the end of the 19th century was a period of fervent optimism, of utopian dreams quickened by an unflinching faith in a glorified ideal called progress. The twin leaders of the cult of progress were science and technology. Science was the new Prometheus, an unstoppable Prometheus that had snatched nature's hidden secrets and passed them on to humanity, brimming over with ardent hopes. In each decade, one major breakthrough in knowledge followed another, each fresh theoretical advance being matched by corresponding success in harnessing nature's powers to our needs. The result was a tremendous surge in growth of technology that promised to liberate humankind from its most stubborn historical limitations. The next century showed just how short-sighted this optimism really was. Indeed, for those who looked deeply enough, the seeds of destruction were already visible right beneath the feet of the proud conquistadors. They could be seen on the home front in the miserable lives of millions of workers condemned to degrading toil in the factories, mines and sweatshops. In the ruthless colonization of the non-Western world, the rape of its resources and subjugation of its peoples. In the mounting friction and tensions between ambitious empires competing for global domination. During the first half of the 20th century, the tensions exploded twice, in 2 world wars with a death count of many millions. These wars and the ensuing Cold War brought into the open the dark primordial forces that had long been simmering just a little beneath the polished veneer of Western civilization. It is surely significant that our discovery of nature's most arcane secret, the convertibility of matter and energy, conferred on us the capacity for total self-annihilation, unlimited power and total destruction arriving in the same package. Today, as we stand at the beginning of the 21st century, our world has become a living paradox. It is a world of immense wealth, but also of grinding poverty, where 1.3 billion people, a quarter of the world's population, live in constant want. A world of tremendous advances in medicine and healthcare, where 11 million people die annually from diseases that are easily treatable. A world where the daily trade in lethal weapons numbers in the millions of dollars, yet where 7 million children die of hunger each year and 800 million people are severely undernourished. And perhaps most alarming of all, a world bent on unlimited economic growth, on a planet whose finite resources are rapidly dwindling. Thus, with our bold strides towards the future, our world still suffers from painful wounds, and the need for a solution, for a cure, has become ever more insistent if humanity is to survive intact through to the end of a new century. In the course of this paper, I wish to formulate a Theravada Buddhist response to the need to heal the wounds of the world. In popular textbooks on world religions, Theravada Buddhism is generally depicted as a religion of individual salvation which holds up as its ideal a purely private enlightenment to be reached through renunciation and meditation. Though Theravada Buddhism does stress the inescapably personal nature of the ultimate goal, if we carefully examine the suttas or discourses of the Buddha, we would see that the Buddha was keenly aware of the problems human beings face in the social dimensions of their lives, and he formulated his teaching to address these problems just as much as to show the way to final liberation. Although these texts are nowhere as numerous as those dealing with personal ethics, meditation, and philosophical insight, they remain remarkable testimonials to the clear sociological acumen of the awakened one. Even today, they still offer clear-cut, practical guidelines in devising a social ethic capable of addressing the problems peculiar to the present age. The first principle that the Buddha's teaching gives us in responding to these problems is a methodological one. Not to rush to foredrawn conclusions, but to investigate the underlying causes at all levels, and not to stop until we have reached the deepest roots. The common tendency today, however, in tackling social problems is quite different. Particularly in political and economic circles, obstinate human dilemmas with subterranean roots are treated simply as technical snags that can be resolved merely by the application of the right technical solution. Thus, it is held, to counter the danger of global warming, we must hammer out a treaty on reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. If crime and violence are on the increase, we need a larger and tougher police force. If drug addiction has reached alarming proportions among our youth, we need more effective controls against drug trafficking. Such measures may indeed be expedient safeguards against the grosser manifestations of the problems they are intended to rectify, but however effective and efficient they may be in the short run, on their own they do not provide long-term solutions. What they offer is cosmetic treatment, stopgap measures that should not be taken as substitutes for alternatives that operate at the level of deeper root causes. When we adopt a Buddhist perspective on the wounds that afflict our world today, we soon realize that these wounds are symptomatic, a warning signal that something is fundamentally awry with the way we lead our lives. We would see these outer wounds as outgrowths of a more malignant wound hidden deep within, eating away at our vital strength and discharging its venom into our air, rivers and oceans, into our forests and farmlands, into our family lives and homes, into our social relationships and political agendas. Thus, from a Buddhist point of view, what we really need to heal our common wounds is radical surgery, a far-reaching change in our collective views, attitudes, and lifestyles. The word that enjoys currency these days as an expression of our need is, quote, values, unquote. We are told that the reason social conditions have degenerated so widely is because people have abandoned traditional values, and all we need to solve our problems is a revival of those values. While such a recommendation can stir up waves of nostalgia in those disturbed by the spread of moral disorder, we must bear in mind that the mere call for a revival of traditional values will be utterly ineffective unless we are prepared to make some bold changes in the foundation on which values rest, namely the aims, purposes, and sense of meaning that determine the social dimension of our existence. To attempt to revive private values in a corrupt and degrading society is like trying to beautify a chemical dump by planting roses along the banks. As long as the dump remains, the roses will only grow up stunted and deformed. The transformation we need has to go further than the merely personal. It must embrace both aspects of our existence, the internal and the external, the personal and the social. These two dimensions of our lives are inseparably intertwined and mutually conditioning, so that our values reflect social and economic realities, while social and economic realities are shaped by our values. Thus, while it is in our personal lives that we have the most power to instigate direct change, any alterations in our personal lifestyles must also reach outwards and exercise an impact on our interpersonal relations, our social order, our political agenda, and our relationship to the natural environment. To avoid turning personal values into a lovely facade covering up social disorder and decay, critical and even painful self-examination is essential. We must be ready to examine with complete honesty our own priorities and to see the dangers for ourselves and others in letting ourselves drift along with the current of egotism and selfishness that sweeps across the world. Without such honest self-criticism, any cry for a recovery of values, even Buddhist values, is bound to end in little more than pious platitudes, personally consoling perhaps, but powerless to bring effective change. When we set out to diagnose our global problems from a Buddhist perspective, we should recognize that an adequate diagnosis must take account of multiple levels of causality. One of the Buddha's most striking insights is that phenomena do not arise from a single cause, but from a complex concurrence of many conditions operating at different levels. Whereas specialist studies deal with problems from within a closed and narrow frame of reference, a Buddhist approach would adopt a comprehensive point of view that takes account of many levels of causation, which crisscross and overlap, reinforcing each other at various turns. This allows for a more comprehensive solution. For when problems are approached from a limited frame of reference, the angle taken in viewing the problems already implies the solution. It is only when this wide-angle perspective is adopted that we can grasp the various dimensions in which the problem projects itself, and thereby we can see the multitude of factors that must be addressed in drawing up a solution. We also have to give heed to the, quote, specific gravity, unquote, of the different types of causation. That is, to the relative contribution they make to the problem as a whole. According to the Buddha, the most powerful and weighty causal factor operative in human life is the mind. Though the mind is invisible, intangible, weightless and dimensionless, it is the hidden vector behind all the other modes of causality, social, political, and economic. The mind does not operate in a vacuum, however. Inevitably, it is always embedded in a specific historical and personal context, subject to the impact of a wide variety of influences which shape its perspectives and determine its dispositions. But while this is so, we must also note that all these other factors influencing the mind are at some level themselves manifestations of mental activity. Thus, the other orders of causality affecting the mind, social, economic, cultural, and political, can in turn be considered objectifications of mind, embodying and externalizing specific attitudes, views, and psychological agendas. For this reason, the Buddha says that, quote, all conditions are preceded by the mind, dominated by the mind, fashioned by the mind, unquote. Dhammapada, verses 1 and 2. When we recognize the enormous contribution the mind makes to every other level of causality, we can see at once that in order to heal the wounds that afflict our world today, our most urgent task is to heal the wounds in our minds. Down the centuries, especially since the start of the scientific revolution in the West, we have been obsessed with the challenge of extending our control and mastery over the external world. But in our enthusiasm to master the outer world and exploit it for our material ends, we have neglected an even more vital dimension of our being, namely, our own minds. For this reason, our triumphs in scientific knowledge and technology have been painfully lopsided. While we have made astounding strides in understanding the world, we have made very little progress in understanding ourselves. While we have tapped the hidden powers of nature and made them our servants, we have done very little to tame the controller of nature. For just this reason, our proud triumphs in science and technology have had a very mixed impact on humanity as a whole. Along with their unquestionable material blessings, they have brought devastation and deprivation, waste and carnage, impoverishment and misery for many millions. The basic needs of human beings are really very simple, and in principle they should be easily met in ample measure for everyone. They include an acceptable standard of material security, fresh air and clean water, nourishing food, comfortable housing, medical care, education and information, and sufficient leisure to develop one's talents and faculties. Under the present system, however, a tiny percentage of people, hardly more than a handful, live in greater luxury than the emperors of ancient Rome, while over 1 billion people, a quarter of the world's population, are condemned to live below the poverty line. Isn't it ironic that while we can send out spacecraft to distant planets and manipulate them with hairpin accuracy, we still cannot feed all the world's children? Isn't it alarming that while all indicators point to the massive threat to health and life from escalating pollution, unprecedented climate change, and the depletion of our natural resources, the nations most responsible for this crisis insist on pursuing unchecked their wasteful, exorbitant lifestyles? What prevents us from meeting the basic needs of all people on earth is not a scarcity of means, but a failure of will, a failure rooted in selfishness and greed. In the Buddha's teaching, the dark forces of the mind responsible for human suffering are called the defilements, kilesa, of which the most powerful are the three, quote, unwholesome roots, unquote, greed, hatred, and delusion. In its classical expression, the Buddha's teaching focuses upon the role of the defilements in our personal lives, showing how they are the determinants of psychological and existential suffering. Today, however, as our world has become tightly integrated into a single global order, a shift in emphasis is necessary if we are to analyse and address our common plight. Since institutions and organisations have become ever more influential in moulding our circumstances and determining our destiny, we must closely investigate how the defilements assume a collective expression. We must lay bare the detrimental impact of our economic and political structures and discover how our forms of social organisation, both national and international, sustain the grip of greed, hatred, and delusion upon our minds. For these structures do not merely objectify the mind's defilements, they also reinforce those defilements and make their grip ever more difficult to cast off. By powerful strategies, often hidden by camouflage and deceit, they nurture and support the mass of distorted views, unhealthy attitudes, and risky policies that wreak so much havoc in our societies and in our lives. Perhaps the most glaring example of this destructive potential in the last decade of the 20th century is the unregulated free market economic system, which today has acquired a global reach. The massive transnational corporations that dominate this economic order, driven by the quest for commercial profit, have turned into institutional embodiments of greed. Despite their impressive public relations propaganda, their fundamental purpose is not to meet genuine human needs, but to generate maximum profit at minimum cost. Profit is the fuel of corporate growth, and every profit target met generates only a still higher target. The ideal is never a state of stable equilibrium, but the achievement of limitless profit at zero cost. For the commanders of the corporate culture, nothing else ultimately matters but economic success. Carefully documented studies have shown that in the pursuit of greater financial gain, the corporations are quite prepared to jeopardize the welfare of the workforce, the health of the customers, the stability of the society, traditional norms and values, the harmony of the community, and the sustainability of the natural environment. In their view, if the net result is a larger profit margin, all these can be sacrificed with barely a shrug of the shoulders. The corporate economy is not only driven by its own inherent greed, but its very success depends on arousing greed in others. For a company to sell its products, to grow and expand, it has to induce in others a desire to buy these products. And to the extent that these products do not meet genuine human needs, which is often the case, the desires must be provoked by deliberate strategies. Hence the twin disciplines of market research and advertising, which exploit every means available to push their clients' products. Television and radio, signboard and newspaper, pictures and jingles, slogans and songs, all are used to hammer home the message, buy this, buy that. The psychological sophistication that underlies the advertisement industry is astounding. there is hardly a human weakness it hesitates to play upon to promote sales. Sexual attraction and status, pride and cupidity, fear and worry, arrogance and vanity, all are fair game in the drive to boost up profits. Behind the specific advertising appeals, there lies a more general assumption, an assumption never explicitly proposed, but made absolutely compelling through countless images and slogans. This is the idea that consumption is the key to happiness. We are made to believe that the way to become happy is to indulge our desires. Happiness is identified with the acquisition of wealth and the enjoyment of commodities, and the more costly and luxurious the goods, the more lavish is the promise of happiness. In the consumerist vision, the enjoyment of goods is nothing less than the good, the final, all-sufficient goal of human life. If we use the Buddha's teachings as a lens to examine the corporate economic system and its offshoot, the consumerist culture, we will see that it is ultimately detrimental to the well-being of both its masters and servants alike. Drawing upon the tools of Buddhist analysis, let us briefly sketch the inner dynamics of this system. We see in the first instance that such a social order is founded upon ignorance or delusion, avidya, moha, namely the supposition that material wealth and consumption are the criteria of the good life. According to the Buddhist texts, when ignorance infiltrates our cognitive systems, it issues in a series of, quote, distortions, unquote, vipallasa, which infect our perception, sanya, thinking, citta, and views, ditthi. The Buddha mentions 4 such distortions. The notions that the impermanent is permanent, that the painful or suffering is pleasant, that the insubstantial is a self, and that the unbeautiful is beautiful. At the most basic level, we perceive things by way of these distortions. When these distorted perceptions are taken up for reflection, we start thinking in terms of them. And finally, under the combined influence of distorted perception and thought, we adopt views, that is, beliefs, doctrines, and ideologies that affirm the mistaken notions of permanence, pleasure, selfhood, and beauty. In modern commercial culture, these distortions, conceptual manifestations of ignorance, dominate the thinking, attitudes, principles, and policy lines of both producers and consumers alike. The illusions of permanence, self, and beauty are sustained by the images that have become such an intimate part of our lives. The happy family using a particular brand of soap, the beautiful woman standing beside the latest model car, the rugged cattleman smoking this particular brand of cigarettes, the self-assured executive drinking that particular brand of whiskey. The inevitable outcome of this commercially aggressive campaign is the exaltation of craving and greed as the fuel of social and economic activity. In free market economics, production is not geared towards the satisfaction of real need, but towards the enhancement of commercial profit, which means that human desires must be subtly manipulated and expanded in a bid to enhance profits. In subservience to the internal demands of this system, the elementary need for material sustenance for the basic requisites of life becomes blown up into an insatiable urge for status, power, and luxury. The masters of commerce strive to create in us a perpetual discontent, to induce feelings of inadequacy, to stir up the need to purchase more. As a result, envy and resentment replace contentment. Titillation replaces satisfaction. Prestige value eclipses life value. The one word to be banished from the dictionaries is, quote, enough, unquote. For the corporate-based economy to flourish, there must never be enough, but always a thirst for more, for the bigger, faster and better, for novelty and variety. In a newly affluent society, perhaps the segment of the population most vulnerable to the tactics of commercial advertising is the youth. The promoters of consumerism know this well. They know how to capitalize on the tender psychological needs of the young, their rebelliousness and audacity, their compulsions and anxieties. And on the basis of this understanding, they attempt to create a specific culture of youth that attaches prestige and prominence to the appropriate commodities. They also know how to control fashions and styles, to make the acquisition of replacements a recurring demand that triggers off regular sprees of buying. For religious cultures that thrive on such traditional values as simplicity, contentment, and self-control, the impact of the global corporate culture can be traumatic, rupturing the lifeline that sustains the transmission of traditional values from one generation to the next. Glorification of the profit motive. In sum, the glorification of the profit motive gives rise to a social order in which the underlying springs of social activity are the twin defilements of ignorance and craving. The experts who defend this system, the advocates of free trade and globalization, tell us that the unrestrained functioning of the economy is the precondition for general human happiness. Quote, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, unquote. But what the Buddha teaches is just the opposite. In a social order governed by ignorance and craving, in which greed, reckless growth and competition are the spurs to mass-scale human activity, the inevitable outcome has to be suffering and conflict. In the formula of the Four Noble Truths, we find this expressed in psychological terms. Quote, craving is the origin of suffering, unquote. Elsewhere, the Buddha has made the same point with specific reference to the breakdown of social cohesion. Quote, from craving comes the search for profit. From seeking comes the gain of profit. From gain comes discrimination. Thence comes desire and lust. Thence attachment. Thence possessiveness. Thence selfishness. Thence hoarding. And from hoarding come many evil, unwholesome things, such as the taking up of clubs and knives, quarrels, conflicts and disputes, recrimination, slander, and falsehood. Unquote. Mahanidana Sutta. Ironically, the linking together of the world's population in the globalized economy is accompanied by a progressive atomization of individuals, which undermines their ability to function as cooperative, responsible members of their societies. This happens because the ultimate effect of corporate culture is to reduce the person to a mere consumer, whose whole being centers on intensity and variety of private experience. In subtle ways that operate below the threshold of perception, the consumerist conception of the good life cuts away at the bonds of community that unite the members of a social order into a unified whole. By appealing to those values that inflame egotism and selfish interest, it replaces social cohesion with a social atomism that locks each individual into a self-enclosed world of his or her own private concerns. The union of autonomous, responsible, disciplined individuals, essential to a true community, gives way to a culture of narcissism, in which each person is obsessed with maximizing his or her own status, wealth, position, and power, the outward signs of material success. If we are puzzled why social discipline and responsibility have become so rare today, reflection on the above may provide an answer. In such a culture as we find in the, quote, developed, unquote, countries of the West, it is hardly surprising that the most basic unit of social formation, the family, has been virtually rent asunder. In the United States, the pioneer in establishing the, quote, New World Order, unquote, roughly half the marriages end prematurely in divorce, and almost 50% of American children grow up in one-parent homes. Even when family bonds endure, the atmosphere of family life has drastically changed from what it used to be in the past. No longer is the family a close, harmonious unit held together by ties of love, respect, self-sacrifice, and cooperation. Instead, it has become a symbiotic pact, a union of convenience, in which each member seeks his or her personal advantage, often by exploiting and hurting the other members. Earlier we saw that the internal dynamics of consumerist culture begin with ignorance or delusion, the assumption that happiness can be achieved through acquisitiveness and the enjoyment of goods. This belief conditions craving, the desire to acquire and enjoy, and the ultimate outcome is frustration, competitiveness, and conflict. In short, personal and collective suffering. In a social order governed by Dhamma, and I use this word here not with narrow reference to Buddhism, but more broadly to signify the universal law of righteousness and truth, the inner dynamics would be the diametric opposite of the one governing the consumerist model. In a righteous society, the role played by ignorance will be exercised by knowledge or wisdom, a basic shared understanding of the fundamental laws of wholesome living. In a predominantly Buddhist society, this would include the law of karma and its fruit, the benefits of generosity and ethical conduct, and some insight into the Four Noble Truths and the three characteristics of existence. Those whose lives are guided by this knowledge need not be perfect saints, and indeed, in mass society, very few will even approximate to any degree of sanctity. But when people are guided by the principles of the Dhamma, they will understand where their true welfare is to be found, and this understanding will enable them to distinguish clearly between what is truly in their interest and what appears attractive on the outside but eventually leads to harm. From the standpoint of practical life, this is the critical distinction. A person enveloped in ignorance easily falls prey to craving, blindly pursues wealth, power, and status, and brings suffering upon himself as well as others. A person guided by the Dhamma understands the true good, the highest goal of life. This understanding stimulates desire, but a kind of desire that is the exact opposite of craving. Craving is a blind desire, a self-centered drive for sensual pleasure, power, and status. In contrast, the desire awakened by true knowledge is a wholesome desire, called in the text, quote, desire for the good, unquote, attakama, or, quote, desire for truth, unquote, Dhammachanda. Motivated by this wholesome desire, a person will engage in virtuous activities that lead to the realization of the good, and these activities will promote the well-being of both the individual and the community. For Buddhism, the highest goal is Nibbana, liberation from ignorance and craving, release from the repetitive cycle of rebirths. In this paper, I do not want to give a philosophical explanation of Nibbana, but a practical one which will highlight the bearings the Dhamma has on our search for a viable social ethic. To go about this task, I intend to examine the experiential dimension of Nibbana in a way that is not rigidly tied to the specific principles of Buddhist doctrine. One of my reasons for adopting such a general approach is to sketch a model for a righteous social order that can be readily appropriated by followers of other religious traditions, and also by those of no religious conviction, who recognize the need for a sane alternative to the consumerist ideal. The task of, quote, healing the wounds of the world, unquote, is not one that any single spiritual tradition can handle alone. We live in a pluralistic society, in a pluralistic world, and what is needed is a cooperative effort by all men and women of spiritual sensitivity, regardless of their faith. While each religion and spiritual path has its own unique perspectives, underlying their obvious differences is a shared perception of the inherent dignity of the human person. It is this perception that must be recovered and safeguarded against the dehumanizing impact of the free market economy and its offshoot, the consumerist society. In terms of living experience, the ultimate goal of Buddhism combines four primary attributes: happiness, peace, freedom, and security. In Pāli, the language of the early Buddhist canon, Nibbana is called Paramasukha, the highest happiness, Anuttara Santivarapada, the supreme state of sublime peace, Vimutti, liberation or deliverance, and Anuttara Yogakkema, the supreme security from bondage. While these aspects of Nibbana may seem far removed from our present condition, a little thought will show that they link up with our most basic aspirations, indeed with the most basic desires of all human beings, regardless of religious affiliation. When we consider the true motivation behind all our actions, it should be immediately clear that what we really desire most is a state that combines these four qualities: happiness, peace, freedom, and security. The reason we fail to attain them is not that we desire their opposites, for no one deliberately seeks to be miserable, distressed, enslaved, and imperiled, but because we misconceive them and thus do not know how to attain them. Under the influence of ignorance and delusion, avidya, we seek our true good in the wrong direction, like a man who wants to go from Kandy to Colombo by heading north on the Matali road. 1. We cannot distinguish true happiness from sensual gratification, and thus we seek happiness by frantically pursuing sensual pleasures, which are transient, degrading, and bound up with anxiety. To try to extract real happiness from sensual pleasures, however, is like trying to satisfy one's thirst by drinking seawater. The more one drinks, the thirstier one becomes. 2. Again, we think that peace means the absence of conflict. Thus we try to gain peace by subduing our opponents and by bullying our environment to serve our desires, unaware that this process is ultimately self-destructive. 3. We identify freedom with license, the freedom to act on impulse, to do whatever we wish. Thus we demand the right to act impetuously without having to pay the price, without having to bear responsibility for our irresponsible actions. 4. We think of security as protection from external harm. Thus we shield ourselves in high-walled homes equipped with high-alert security systems. Yet we never feel completely safe, but live in the shadow of fear, of an anxiety that swells up from within. What the Buddha teaches so clearly is that we must look within to achieve the vital goal towards which we aspire. He points out that real happiness, peace, freedom, and security have to be attained by overcoming the mental fetters that bind us so tightly to suffering. These fetters are the mind's defilements: greed, hatred, and delusion, along with their many offshoots such as anger, malice, jealousy, stinginess, hypocrisy, obstinacy, conceit, arrogance, vanity, and heedlessness. Thus, to win our goal, we must turn the beam of our searchlight upon the mind itself and invest our energy in the task of self-purification. While Nibbana itself, in its fullness, may be remote from the common person, mired in mundane responsibilities, this does not mean it is completely inaccessible to us. For Nibbana is defined as the destruction of greed, hatred, and delusion, and this means that the goal must be reached by a gradual process which centres on the task of diminishing greed, hatred, and delusion in our everyday lives. We might even speak of the goal as, quote, bending back, unquote, or, quote, reaching down, unquote, and intersecting with our everyday concerns, spelling out the prerequisites for its own attainment. To advance towards Nibbana from where we presently stand means that we must work to attenuate the influence of the defilements in our daily conduct, in our deeds, words, and thoughts. What we must do is replace greed with non-greed, with generosity, detachment, contentment, and simplicity. Instead of hoarding and accumulating things, Buddhism emphasizes the value of giving. The practice of generosity is the most effective way to erase the greed from one's own mind, as well as to confer benefits on others. Instead of nurturing hatred and resentment, we are to develop loving kindness and compassion towards others, to cooperate with them in meeting our common goals, and to bear adversity with patience and equanimity. And instead of remaining in the clouds of delusion, we are to develop wisdom, to acquire understanding and insight into the invariable laws that underlie human existence. The work of self-purification is to be undertaken by treading the Noble Eightfold Path, with its 3 divisions of virtue, concentration, and wisdom. Each of these 3 divisions of the path is intended to check and remove the defilements at successively subtler levels. The training in virtue, which comprises right speech, right action, and right livelihood, checks the outward expression of the defilements in transgressive action, in conduct that violates the norms of the moral life. The training in concentration, which comprises right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration, aims at eliminating the active eruption of the defilements into our thought processes. And the training in wisdom, which comprises right view and right intention, aims at eradicating the defilements at the most fundamental level, as subtle seeds in the deep recesses of the mind. It is only when these defilements have been completely uprooted by wisdom, by direct insight into the true nature of phenomena, that ignorance is completely removed and knowledge fulfilled. And it is this that brings the realization of Nibbana, the highest happiness, peace, freedom, and security, right in this very life. I want to emphasize here that while the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path is inescapably personal, requiring individual effort and diligence, this practice has consequences that are profoundly and inextricably social. As I pointed out earlier, society is not an abstract entity, but the aggregate mass of its individual members. If we compare society to an organism, then its members are like the cells. And just as the health of a body's cells affects the well-being of the physical organism, so the conduct, attitudes and values of a society's members inevitably influence the health of the social organism. We need cherish no illusions that it will be feasible to marshal an entire society to walk along the Noble Eightfold Path. It is difficult enough, even, to get people to live a decent, upright life governed by sound moral guidelines. The forces of darkness, of materialism and consumerism have become so powerful, so seductive, so overwhelming that it is only too easy to accept their propaganda as invincible truth. With the trend towards the globalized economy, those who dominate the corporate culture have brought virtually all the media under their control, and thus to dispel the consumerist mirage is a most formidable challenge indeed. Yet the seeds of this system's own destruction have already sprung up from within itself. In its growing polarization of the world into the rich and the poor, in its aggressive assault on every obstacle to corporate profit, in its disregard for basic human values, and of most importance today, in its reckless exploitation of the Earth's own life support systems. Today we stand at a forked road, a road whose branches extend in two different directions. The choice of which road to take will decide our fate, our personal fate and that of our planet. The road that has brought us to our present impasse is that of untrammeled development guided by a profit-oriented economic system. By extending our understanding of the physical world, science has conferred on us commanding powers over nature, a degree of control that is truly staggering. But the mastery we have won over the external world has been gained at the neglect of mastery over ourselves. To continue in this way, focused exclusively on more external development, is to place our very survival in jeopardy. That this risk is very real can be seen from the Conference on Climate Change in Kyoto, 1997. Virtually every country that participated, West and East, insisted on the right to pursue the path of unrestricted economic growth, even though this means that in the future the pollution of our air and water will become unbearable and unpredictable climate change may cause large-scale calamities. Indeed, one gets the impression that in their rush to win a share of the good life, people are ready to flirt with the prospect that by their unbridled greed they may rip away the very support systems that make life on Earth possible. The other road does not involve a rejection of science and technology, but a recognition of their proper place in the scale of human values. Their function is to serve the human community, to alleviate want, and to help provide the material prosperity needed as a basis for the pursuit of other goals: cultural, intellectual, and spiritual development. What we need most urgently today is a shift in emphasis from external development to internal development. To focus upon internal development is not to escape into a private realm of subjective fantasy or to spurn the demands of social responsibility, but to organize our priorities in the way that brings the fullest realization of the human potential at the deepest level. The great spiritual teachers tell us that the goals of human life are governed by a scale of values, and that within this scale the highest value belongs to the highest goal. For Buddhism, this is the attainment of enlightenment and liberation, the attainment of Nibbana, to be won by treading the Noble Eightfold Path. While the laws of the spiritual life have always held true, what we are being compelled to see today, with a clarity never before so striking, is the inextricable dependence of the external, material dimension of our existence on the internal, psychological dimension. In countless ways, the point is being driven home to us that the world we share is a collective reflection of our minds, its social, economic, and political structures, the outward projections of our thought patterns and value schemes. For this reason, our common welfare, perhaps even our survival as a species, depends on a large-scale transformation of consciousness. This transformation must cut clear across all boundaries, east and west, north and south, dissolving obstinate attitudes and assumptions that are ultimately self-destructive. If I were to sum up in concise terms the implications that the Buddha's message has for us today, as we slide into the 21st century, it would be this: that we must recognize that the wounds that afflict our world are symptoms of the wounds that afflict our minds. Our collective problems, from child prostitution to ecological devastation, from political corruption to corporate imperialism, are warning signs writ large of the destructive distortions in views and values that have sunk so deeply into our hearts. The bright side of the Buddha's message is that human beings can change. They are not held helpless captives of the mind's dark defilements, but by acknowledging their predicament, their suffering and anguish, they can begin the slow, hard task of tackling the causes and thereby set about freeing themselves. Surely such goals as social justice, relief from poverty, an end to communal conflict, and the protection of our natural environment deserve a top place on our agenda. But what the Buddha's teaching leads us to see is that we cannot reasonably expect to resolve these formidable social problems as long as we continue in our personal lives to move in the same familiar ruts of greed, carelessness, and selfishness. To heal the wounds of our world, we must work to heal the wounds of our heart, the deep, hidden wounds of greed, hatred, and delusion. The message, admittedly, is a difficult one, for inner changes always require greater effort than outer achievements, especially when the first step is self-understanding. In the final analysis, however, it is the only approach that will work, and this certainly makes it worthy of our attention. I wish to close this paper with some words referring specifically to the condition of Buddhism within Asia. When we look at the way of life gaining ascendancy in Buddhist Asia today, it seems that the true Dhamma is rapidly losing its influence. There may be plenty of temples, gigantic Buddha images looking out on us from the hills and roadways, and monks visible in all the major cities and towns. But a life inspired and guided by the Dhamma, based on moral rectitude, on loving kindness and compassion, on respect and care for others, all this is in alarming decline. To prevent the true Dhamma from disappearing, radical and far-sighted steps will have to be taken. To keep the Dhamma alive through the coming generations, it is most essential to find ways to make the teaching meaningful to the younger generation. Given the way Buddhism is practiced in Asia today, it seems that an educated young person will see it in little more than a system of rites and rituals, useful perhaps as a reminder of one's cultural and ethnic identity, but with very little relevance to our present concerns. The youth are the ones who will have to see that Buddhism survives into the next generation, and that it will be able to offer its rich insights and spiritual practices to the global community. If we lose the youth to materialism and the cult of self-indulgence, we have lost the future of Buddhism, and at best, all that will survive will be the outer crust of the religion, not its vital essence. Success in keeping Buddhism alive requires that the true spiritual core of the Dhamma be extracted from its often constricting and deadening institutional embodiments. Above all, this task demands that the Dhamma be treated not as a basis for ethnic identity or cultural pride, but as a living path of spiritual development and personal transformation that touches our most fundamental attitudes, goals, and values. It is only when the Dhamma is appropriated in such a way that it will serve to heal the wounds in our own minds and hearts, and it is only by healing the wounds within that we can face the momentous task of helping to heal the wounds of the world. This has been a Buddhist Social Ethic for the New Century. From Facing the Future, 4 essays on the social relevance of Buddhism by Bhikkhu Bodhi. Narrated by Shalina Hetherington. Copyright 2000 Bhikkhu Bodhi. Audio production copyright 2023 Pariyatti.
Pariyatti, a non-profit 501c3 organization, offers a wide variety of books, eBooks, videos, and audiobooks about the teachings of the Buddha, the Pāli language, and Vipassana meditation. Browse our complete catalog at www.pariyatti.org.